Our speaker tonight is William Fowler, Jr., the director of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And Bill was also a professor at Northeastern University for many, many years. And I've heard rumors to the effect that he may very well go back there again in very soon. And he got his undergraduate degree at Northeastern and his doctorate at the University of Notre Dame. And he's author of many books, as I'm sure many of you are aware. A few of them are The Baron of Beacon Hill, which was a biography of John Hancock, a three-volume series on the history of the Navy from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War, Rebels Under Sail, Jack Tars and Commodores, and Under Two Flags. And then also wrote a biography of Samuel Adams, more recently, Samuel Adams, Puritan Radical, in addition to his new book, which is basically the same title as the lecture tonight. And Bill has been a trustee or on the board of many, many historical organizations in the Boston area. At this date, he's on the board of the Wayside Inn, the Ralph Waldo Emerson Association, the Paul Revere House, and the Old North Association. And he's also lectured and taught in many places besides Northeastern, including Mystic Seaport, the Smithsonian, the United States Naval War College, and the Sea Education Association. The title of Bill's lecture tonight is The French and Indian War and the Struggle for North America. And I'd like you please all to welcome Professor William Fowler.
Thank you, Patrick. It's a great honor to be the guest this evening of two of Boston's most distinguished historical organizations, the Paul Revere House and the Old South. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm also grateful, Pat, for that splendid introduction. It's one that on occasion I have not gotten. In my role as director of the Historical Society, I spend a fair amount of my time traveling about the Commonwealth, speaking at local historical societies. I probably sat through more business meetings of local historical societies than you can ever imagine. And a few weeks ago, I was in the western part of the Commonwealth, and I was seated in the audience waiting to go on at this society, and the treasurer was giving her report. And the report, she said, was a very good one. Indeed, she said it was very good, that there is now enough money in the society treasury that in the future they would be able to afford better speakers. So, thank you, Patrick. Early on the morning of May the 28th, 1754, a small group of Virginia militia and Indians, under the command of a 22-year-old Virginia militia major named George Washington, surrounded a group of sleeping Frenchmen at a place called Jumonville Glen, not too far from Pittsburgh. There, in that early morning light, those Virginia militia and Indians, without warning, opened fire on the French. It was, according to later accounts, an assassination. Horace Walpole, the English gadfly and London gossip, when he heard this news, declared that Major Washington had set the world afire. Well, indeed, he had. My own interest in the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, whatever you wish to call it, arises from the fact that I'm a New Englander. I grew up in this area, lived for most of my life in this area. I grew up in a family where in the summertime, of course, we took those dreadful automobile trips, the forced march into history. I grew up in a family where we stopped to read all of the roadside plaques. And it seemed to me at the time that they were all about the French and Indian War. In fact, my first memory of visiting an historic site is visiting Fort Ticonderoga. Well, as I grew older, of course, I took up reading. And naturally, I turned to James Fenimore Cooper, The Last of the Mohegans, intrigued some more. When my vocabulary grew a little bit, I picked up Francis Parkman and read Montcalm and Wolfe. I learned a great deal about the French and Indian War, and then as I studied history more deeply as a graduate student and as a professional, and began to spend more time in Canada, I realized that our Canadian friends did not refer to it as the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War. They called it the War of the Conquest. And I learned, too, as I studied the war more, that it wasn't just fought at Ticonderoga or Fort William Henry or Fort Pitt or Duquesne, but that it was fought around the world, that it was truly, truly the world's first World War. It pitted two superpowers against one another, France and England, in a titanic struggle for imperial domination. This was not, of course, the first time that France and England had fought. They had been fighting since at least 1066. But most of their previous wars had been about a monarchical succession or some duchy or fishing rights, some minor kind of thing. This was not a war that was about minor territory or boundaries. This was a war that was fought to see which power would in fact dominate the continents of the world. It was a war that was fought in nearly every ocean, in battlefields in Europe, in North America, in the West Indies, in Asia, in India, in Africa. It was the war in which Clive distinguished himself in India, where the black legend of the Black Hole of Calcutta originated. It was the war about the siege of Havana, where more than 10,000 British soldiers and sailors died of disease, of malaria and typhus and yellow fever. It was the war in which Frederick the Great distinguished himself and earned the reputation as the world's greatest military genius. Frederick, who fended off all of the great European powers, who declared that he was descended upon by the three Furies, Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria, Tsarina Elizabeth, and Madame de Pompadour, King Louis's princess, King Louis's mistress. Every major power entered into this European war. Every single power at one time or another was involved in the fray. At the end, more than 1 million men died, and at the final peace, negotiators traded more territory in extent than all of Western Europe. England emerged victorious, and its triumph laid the foundation for the great British Empire. Its triumph gave England access to the resources and wealth that would make her the industrial power of the world and that would create and engine the Industrial Revolution and create the world in which we live today. It's a grand and sweeping tale, and I hope that I've told it well. But it's also the story of individuals. It's the story of cultures and nations in conflict. Too often, I fear, historians are likely to take this grand, sweeping approach to history, and they forget about people, about persons. And so this evening, I'd like to share with you three stories, three people who were engaged in this war, each of them coming from a different culture, and through their lives, their struggles, I think we can better understand what this war was all about. A Frenchman, the Marquis de Montcalm. An Englishman, Sir Geoffrey Amherst. And a Native American, a Delaware, Teddy Ushing. First, the Marquis de Montcalm. Montcalm was a minor, emphasis upon minor, French nobleman from Languedoc. He had served his king well as a professional soldier in the numerous wars of Europe, been wounded many times, and been decorated by the king. But despite his achievements, he had never risen above the rank of colonel. When war broke out in Europe in 1756, Montcalm desperately wanted to rejoin the army in Europe. He was a cavalryman. That's where the glory was. But instead, he was offered command in Canada. First, he had to be shown where it was. He did not want the Canadian command. It was far distant, beyond glory, beyond Versailles. It was an outpost. Nonetheless, he was forced to take the command. And on March the 1st, 1756, he received orders for Quebec. He arrived in Quebec on the 17th of May, journeyed immediately to Montreal, and there he met the Governor-General of Canada, the Marquis de Vaudreuil. The Marquis de Vaudreuil was a native-born Canadian. He was the first royal governor of Canada to be a native-born Canadian, and he was proud of that. He deeply, deeply resented Montcalm as a Frenchman coming to take command over a land that was Vaudreuil's home. They took an instant dislike for one another. Montcalm described Vaudreuil as a good man, but somewhat weak. And then Montcalm described the Canadians. Mind you, that in 1756, there were a lot of native-born Canadians, French Canadians, many of them serving very well in the Canadian militia and in a particularly efficient organization called the Troupe de la Marine. Experienced, hard-fought soldiers. But Montcalm had no use for these Canadians. He wrote home to the Minister of War describing some of the Canadian officers. He said, "Mercier is a weakling and an ignoramus. Saint-Luc, a garrulous braggart. Montagnier, admirable, but a looter. Marin, brave, but stupid. The rest are not worth mentioning." So much for the Canadians. Vaudreuil returned these sentiments and described Montcalm as a foppish, parade ground soldier who cared nothing for Canada, and that was certainly true. The two men barely spoke. The Governor-General, the Commanding General, barely spoke to one another. To be sure, Montcalm had a tough job. France cared little for Canada. France was a continental nation, deeply involved in the affairs of Europe, and Canada was, in fact, a distant outpost. Voltaire had referred to Canada as a few acres of snow. Montcalm understood his situation. He had few soldiers, few regular soldiers, and the king was not likely to send him many more. On occasion, he would write to the Minister of War plaintively. He asked for more troops, but never received them. And indeed, on one occasion, the Minister of War in Versailles told Montcalm, wrote to the general, quote, "One does not try to save the stables when the house is on fire." Montcalm would get little help. Montcalm was also a defeatist. From the moment that he landed in Canada, he thought he was going to lose. And of course, he would. That lack of confidence spread amongst the troops. Montcalm made no secret that he thought they would lose. Despite important victories that the French had, the French, indeed, in the first 2 years of the war, were triumphant. They captured Fort Oswego on Lake Ontario. They took Fort William Henry. They repulsed a British attack at Ticonderoga. But despite those victories, Montcalm was never confident, never confident. It does seem to me that Montcalm's defeatism indeed informed his most important and fateful decision. In 1759, General Wolfe, James Wolfe, arrived at Quebec with a British army and laid siege to the French citadel. June, July, August, into early September, Wolfe's army surrounded Quebec. Several times when they tried to attack the fortress, they had been repulsed. Wolfe himself, who was a bit strange, was also thinking about defeat. It was that one final gamble that Wolfe made, sailing up the St. Lawrence River, coming behind the citadel of Quebec, and landing his troops at the Anse-le-Foulon, and climbing up to the Plains of Abraham. And it was then that Montcalm looked out from the walls of Quebec City and saw the British army there in front of him on the Plains of Abraham, an army not much larger than his own. And it was that moment that Montcalm made that fateful and wrong decision. He should have stayed behind the walls of Quebec City and let the Canadian winter do the job for him. But instead, in a sort of fateful way, almost resigned to defeat, he took his army out of the protection of the city on to the Plains of Abraham, and there engaged with the British, and there lost, thereby sealing the fate of Quebec. And of course, in a final irony, there he died. And so too did General Wolfe. It is no end of irony to me as I visit Canada quite often, particularly in the province of Quebec. And everywhere that one goes, one sees statues and commemorations of Montcalm, a hero to the French in Quebec, despite the fact that he detested them, and despite the fact that perhaps in great degree he can be blamed for them living in an Anglo world. The second person is an Englishman, Sir Geoffrey Amherst, Lord Amherst, or as the song goes, a soldier of the king. Geoffrey Amherst was able but not likable. I know historians are expected to be objective and critical. I try to be, but every once in a while I simply abandon it. In my work on this book, I grew to not like Geoffrey Amherst. And let me explain to you why. He entered the Army at age 14, not unusual at the time. He had the great good fortune to have a mentor, Lord Ligonier, who was the commander-in-chief of the British Army. Sir John Ligonier was an icon to the British in the mid-part of the 18th century. And Ligonier referred to young Amherst as my dear pupil. Amherst was a logistical genius. He knew how to organize a campaign. He knew how to move troops and supplies. He was a genius at moving large amounts of supplies and men. No one was better at that than Lord Amherst. In October of 1757, Ligonier became the commander-in-chief of the British Army. In 1757, America was a mess. The British Army was reeling back from Oswego, from Ticonderoga, William Henry. They were reeling back. They needed a new commander, and so Ligonier sent Amherst. It seemed to him that the war in North America demanded his skills at organization and transportation. Amherst immediately set to work for an expedition against Louisbourg, the great French fortress on Cape Breton Island. Amherst organized an expedition against Louisbourg in 1758. He had the able help of a young brigadier, James Wolfe, with him, and Amherst did manage to capture Louisbourg. The capture of Louisbourg helped to open the way towards the chief target, the great prize in North America, Quebec City. And in 1759, William Pitt, Prime Minister, directed Lord Amherst to take Quebec. The plan was for Amherst to advance north via Lake Champlain, to organize his force around Albany, move to Lake George, then up to Lake Champlain, and attack from that direction. In the meantime, of course, General Wolfe would attack via the St. Lawrence, coming up the St. Lawrence, having organized at Halifax. And the two armies were scheduled to meet there near Quebec and advance on Montcalm. Well, the fact of the matter is, Amherst, the logistical genius, spent the entire summer organizing organizing. He had the best organized army in North America. But, as one person remarked, he was like St. George on the tavern sign, always moving but never advancing. And so Amherst's army simply sat and never moved. Well, Wolfe, of course, did in fact move and did take Quebec. Eventually, Amherst will move, not via Lake Champlain, but he will move farther west to Lake Ontario and then descend the St. Lawrence, and it will be General Amherst who will take the final surrender of the French in September 1760 at Montreal. What is not likable about General Amherst is his attitude towards Native Americans. One ought not to be naive in dealing with the issue of racism in history, and certainly we see it all the time, not only in history but in contemporary life. And I'm not going to tell you that I was particularly surprised at some of the comments that Amherst made, but I was certainly surprised at the continuous volume of the comments that he made. I could find nothing in other correspondence of officers that even came close to Amherst's attitude towards the Native Americans. It came out particularly sharp during Pontiac's Rebellion. This is a war fought shortly after the French surrendered in 1763. In the summer of 1763, the great Ottawa chief Pontiac led an uprising, a rebellion of the Western Indians against the newly arrived British authorities. Amherst, at the time, was the commander-in-chief in North America, and it fell upon him to put down this rebellion. Amherst was furious at the Indian attack, and the Indians did indeed make quick work of some of the British. The only forts in the West that held out against Pontiac was Fort Pitt, Pittsburgh, and Detroit. All of the other British posts fell to the Ottawa, the Wyandottes, and the others. Amherst directed the repression of this Indian rebellion. He ordered his soldiers to distribute smallpox blankets infected with smallpox, to the Native Americans. I know we often see that as a rumor or as gossip, as speculation. It's not. Amherst was quite willing to write these orders, and did indeed write these orders to his officers to distribute blankets infected with smallpox. To Captain Henry Gladwin, the commander at Detroit, Amherst sent orders, quote, "Put every Indian in your power to death." To Henry Bouquet, the officer charged with marching west, he told Bouquet to carry with him and to seek out these Indians and to slay them all. To Lieutenant Valentine Gardner, another officer in the West, Amherst wrote that the Indians, quote, "are the vilest race of beings that ever infested this earth, and whose riddance from it must be esteemed a meritorious act for the good of mankind." Now again, I suggest to you that I certainly have read enough correspondence of British and French officers, and American officers for that matter, of the 18th century, to know that they certainly were not particularly fond of Native Americans, and racism does run through a good deal of their attitudes. But I never have found anything as vile, as violent, as what I found in the correspondence of Sir Geoffrey Amherst. The third person, a Delaware Indian. His name, Teddioushing. He was a Delaware, born near present-day Trenton, New Jersey. He was an Indian who lived on the margins of white society. By the mid-18th century, the Delawares had been driven west out of their homelands, and they had been driven west by an act of one of the great land scandals of 18th century America, the so-called Delaware Walking Purchase. In 1686, William Penn had negotiated a land settlement with the Delawares, by which he acquired the land to build Philadelphia. And the land boundaries, uncertain always in the 18th century, had been defined by the distance a man could walk in a single day. It was called the walking purchase. William Penn was an honorable man, and in 1686 the purchase, how far a man could walk in a day, was appropriately done. However, William Penn's land-hungry descendants renegotiated the deal. They wanted to enlarge the walking purchase. The Delawares agreed, only what the Delawares didn't know is that the white settlers had cut paths through the woods and hired Olympic runners. And by the time this walking purchase was over, the Delawares had found themselves virtually landless. And the Delawares then moved west towards the valley of the Ohio. There, as they moved west towards the valley of the Ohio, though, they encountered the Iroquois from New York, a very, very powerful Indian confederation, far more powerful than the Delaware. And so the Delaware found themselves caught between the hammer and the hard place, between the white settlers to the east and the Iroquois to the west. And they were vassals to both. Teddy-Ushing, the Delaware, was a leader of his people, but he was not a chief. He was not a chief. His skill was oratory. He had a phenomenal capacity to wow the crowd. In many ways, as I was writing about Teddy-Ushing, he struck me how similar he was to William Pitt, the great British war leader. Pitt could spellbind the House of Commons. Well, Teddy-Ushing could spellbind a council. And that was how he held power, through the power of his oratory and rhetoric. In 1750, he was baptized a Moravian at a Moravian mission. He took on Christianity, he and his family took on Christianity fairly lightly, more as a cultural artifact than as any religious conversion. When the war broke out, he allied himself with the French. Made sense. The English had been his enemy. But then when the French began to lose, he negotiated with the British. He sought help from whichever side would aid his people. The Native Americans were not vassals to either the French or the British. In fact, in many ways, they were fighting their own parallel war. They knew that neither the French nor the English wished them well. Their task was how to balance between the two, or to exploit the two to their own advantage. Teddy-Ushing did all that he could to protect his people from the French, the English, and from the Iroquois. With the collapse of French power, though, gradually in the West, as the British noose tightened on the French, Teddy-Ushing faced a gloomy prospect. The prospect was that the Iroquois and the British would be his masters. That predicament was summed up at a meeting that took place in June of 1762 in Easton, Pennsylvania. Sir William Johnson, His Majesty's Indian agent, a man who held a baronial place there on the banks of the Mohawk River, Johnson Hall, still there today. It's an historic site. Sir William was there to preside. Teddy-Ushing rose to speak for the Delawares. Teddy-Ushing recited all that had gone before, the oral tradition. Native Americans had at this time no writing, and so everything that Teddy-Ushing said were things that he remembered, that had been told to him by those who had come before. And then when he finished, Sir William and his associates laid upon the table a mound of documents, the documents refuting everything that Teddy-Ushing had said. Teddy-Ushing then asked Sir William Johnson, "Might I have my own clerk?" Sir William responded that the king's clerk, i.e., the clerk being paid by Sir William Johnson, would suffice to record the meeting. 4 days later, After much discussion, back and forth, Teddy Ushing rose. He turned to Sir William Johnson, and he said, "I desire you'll let me have the writings which were read yesterday, that I may have time to consider of them, as we did not understand what was said. You promised to see justice done, but when you refused to let me have a clerk, I began to fear you intend to do as George Croghan did when we were 5 years since. King George has ordered you to hear me. But how do you think I can make answer at once to so many papers as your clerk was 4 hours reading in a language I do not understand and which has not been interpreted to me?" Sir William rose and adjourned the meeting. The following spring, Teddy Ushing and his wife were burned to death in a fire that we would describe today of suspicious origin. 3 people, 3 different cultures in conflict here in North America. The French are gone. Well, mostly gone. French Canadians are not, certainly. The British survived, and they triumphed. We are today the descendants, the benefactors of that triumph. But within America today, this continent, 2 great nations have emerged from that war. And at the same time, 2 peoples remain. One French-Canadian and one Native Americans. Both of them surviving, giving testimony, I think, to the persistence of cultures under adversity to survive. That came home to me in a rather interesting way when I was just sort of finishing this book. And I happened upon an account of something that happened in the city of Quebec. And I'd like to just read you that description. The French and Indian War marked the beginning of a long decline for the native peoples in Canada and the United States. Their decisive role in that war has often been ignored, as shown on a fall morning in 2001, when a reporter for the Montreal Gazette described a moving ceremony. On that day, the Marquis de Montcalm's simple brown casket was removed from its resting place in the chapel of the Ursuline convent. It was draped with the French flag under which he had served and then placed on a carriage. The Montcalm honor guard flanked the carriage on both sides. Soldiers, bearing flags with the crest of each regiment Montcalm commanded, followed. The cortege wound its way through the narrow streets of Old Quebec as citizens and tourists stood silently watching. The procession entered the cemetery of the General Hospital, and there, with proper ceremony, Montcalm was buried among his soldiers. Standing nearby, a British regiment, Fraser's Highlanders, played a musical tribute. The report did not mention any native peoples present. They were once again invisible. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to try to answer any easy questions you might have.
Folks, if we could use the handheld mic, because this is being recorded by WGBH, and that will be recorded better.
Excellent.
Hi, my name is Eric Cooper. I'm a graduate student in history at BU. There's another people that were in many hundreds of thousands, and that's the African Americans at that time. Can you talk a little bit about their experience during this conflict?
During this conflict, the African Americans, of course, slaves, were confined to the southern part of the United States and really did not, well, by this time, by the 1760s, escaped slaves from the South had indeed escaped from plantation life, had indeed gone west and to some degree had intermingled with the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and that area. So you do have an African American presence in that regard, this intercultural relationship. Other than that, there were not in the French and Indian War, there were not in North America any black soldiers raised. Now, interestingly enough, when the British assaulted Havana in 1762, they actually did buy about 1,000 slaves from slave owners in Jamaica to bring the slaves to Havana to work on the engineering tasks, to mount the artillery and that sort of thing. So slaves were used in the West Indies, certainly by the British, for engineering and sappers and that sort of thing. But not in North America, not in this particular time period, no.
At the beginning of your talk, you described the first encounter with George Washington and the Indians and the French. And this is a topic about which I've known very little, the whole topic. Yeah. But the puzzling thing to me was, why did the Indians or the Native Americans join with George Washington in that attack? What was their purpose? Were they deciding that the English would be better for them than the French, or what? I didn't get that.
The Native Americans who, first, just a quick bit of background. Washington and other Virginia planters were deeply engaged in land speculation in the West, in the Ohio Valley. The royal governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, had learned that the French were in fact coming down the Allegheny, Monongahela, towards that the place where the Ohio River is formed, that today we know as Pittsburgh. The, quote, invasion of the French alarmed Dinwiddie and the Virginia planters because they stood to lose money, because their lands were now being compromised by the French. And so Dinwiddie sent Washington, a young surveyor, by the way, a man of immense physical prowess. That Washington's simple physical presence was very impressive. And he was a man who was accustomed to living in the rough. He had been a surveyor, been out west. So Dinwiddie naturally selects Washington to send him west. Now, the Native Americans who joined Washington aren't many, by the way. At this time, most of them are siding with the French, wisely siding with the French. The Native Americans who are with Washington, led by a chief named Tanagrisson, are what they called Mingoes. The Mingoes were Iroquois who had been displaced from New York and had come down into the Ohio Valley. So the Native Americans, the Indians who were with Washington, were not many, and at this point, 1753, 54, into 55, most Native Americans in the West were likely to be allies of the French and not allies of the English. And they were with Washington as guides. And they were the men, Tanagrisson and his men, were the ones who led Washington to where the French were at this place called Jumonville Glen.
Was the town of Amherst named after General Amherst?
Certainly was. So was in the college.
Then why would that be if there's such proof that he was out to destroy the Native Americans?
I think you'll have to ask the people in Amherst. There was a movement not so long ago, I think. I don't remember, maybe someone else remembers here in the audience to change the name of the town of Amherst to, I don't know what they change it to, but to something else. But General Amherst is not my favorite person.
Yes, would you please discuss Rogers Rangers?
Oh, sure. Robert Rogers was an officer from New Hampshire. Actually, he was born in Methuen, Massachusetts, but he's ordinarily assigned to have come from New Hampshire. During the early days of the war, it became quite obvious that the regular British soldiers, who were the finest in the world, by the way, we have a tendency as American historians to disparage the redcoats Well, not to be disparaged, they were superb soldiers. But in many ways, they were not suited for some of the scouting that needed to be done, some of the reconnaissance that needed to be done in the thick woods of North America. Robert Rogers was an officer in the New Hampshire militia, and Rogers came forward and offered to General Loudon at the time an opportunity to bring some of his men, some of his militia, together, men who were quite accustomed to the frontier, to the wilderness. They liked to, and they were expert at ranging, meaning going out. And so they came to be called rangers. These were men who were pretty adept at what we would call today guerrilla warfare, very adept at scouting, long-range patrols, that sort of thing. And so Rogers led these men primarily in the area around Lake Champlain, Lake George, was the principal area where Rogers Rangers operated. We know them best, of course. We know them best through that wonderful historical novel, Northwest Passage. Kenneth Roberts wrote about Robert Rogers. Spencer Tracy looks just like Robert Rogers. They were quite useful. They were so useful, in fact, that the British Army eventually emulated them and began to develop their own corps of rangers. The British never trusted Robert Rogers, didn't trust the Americans, period, and preferred to do it themselves. And so they did, in fact, adopt and train some of their men in Rogers' techniques, in his ranging techniques. Well, he's got a question over here.
Bill, in your introductory remarks, you alluded to some of the global ramifications of the war. Perhaps in 25 words or less, you could let us know what those are, particularly west of the Mississippi and Asia and Europe.
We, as Americans, tend to view the British Empire in a somewhat unusual way, and that is that somehow we feel that in 1776 or 1783, pick your date, that it all came to an end for them, that the loss of America was just catastrophic. It wasn't at all. The loss of America was not catastrophic to the British Empire. In fact, in the history of the British Empire, it was something of a blip on the screen. The real achievement of the empire came in 1763, because it was in 1763 that once and for all it was clear that Britain would rule the seas, that her armies would dominate the continents of Europe, would dominate Asia, India, the West Indies. It was from those parts of the world that she would draw the enormous resources that she was going to need in the 19th century for the Industrial Revolution. So it did, in fact, transform the war. In the American Revolution, they lost the colonies, but from an economic point of view, it really didn't do them much harm because we continued to trade with them. We were their best customer. So this war created the British Empire. It left England for that moment, and perhaps we should think about this on occasion, as at that moment in 1763, in many ways, Great Britain was the sole superpower.
As a result of the Jumonville affair, wasn't there sort of an arrest warrant issued for Washington on the charge of murder?
The Jumonville affair, of course, took place in May. Within a very few weeks, the French reacted quickly. In fact, it turned out that Jumonville, the young officer who commanded that small force there, was killed in the attack. His brother shows up at Fort Duquesne, and when his brother hears about what happened, he wants to immediately attack. And so the French launch a counterattack of several hundred men. By this time, Washington has retreated to a place he calls Fort Necessity. And it's a very poor fort, not a very good defensive position. The French show up with about 4 times the number of soldiers he has. And so Washington has to surrender. Well, if you can imagine this now, here is Washington. It's raining out, it's night, it's muddy, it's dark. He sends 2 of his men to negotiate with the French. Neither of them speak French. Okay? The French officers write out the capitulation terms in French, naturally, and the capitulation terms are brought back to Washington in this hut. They're trying to read it. They can't even quite read it. Washington doesn't read French. He's got another officer who's a Dutchman who reads French, sort of. Okay? And in the midst of this capitulation document is an admission that Washington admits to assassinating. The word assassination is in the document. So Washington actually signs, it's a surrender, a capitulation, in which he admits that he assassinated the French soldiers under the command of Ensign Jumonville. Well, the French, it's documentary evidence. Washington later says, I didn't know what I was doing. The light was bad. I couldn't read French. Didn't happen. Think of all the, deniabilities. Fact of the matter is, and it's probably true that he really didn't understand what he was signing. But he did admit to that. And yes, there's a great historical controversy. There are those who say it wasn't what it was. From all the evidence that I can see, that I've seen, it seems to me pretty clear. Pretty clear. Washington initiated, or Washington's men in any case, initiated the attack upon a peaceful group of French soldiers. The two nations were not at war. The territory in which they both were was territory which could be logically said to be in dispute. Okay, in dispute. Washington initiated the attack. He killed the French in an area that was in dispute. And then later, of course, he signs this capitulation in which he admits to all the facts, but then denies it. The beginning of a presidential tradition.
What part did William Williams play in the war, and wasn't he a signer of the Declaration of Independence?
Are you talking William Williams or Ephraim Williams? The Williams College?
The one from Connecticut. I'm not sure if there's a Williams College named after him.
The college is named after Roger Williams, but
William Williams.
No, I don't know William Williams from Connecticut. No.
Signer of the Declaration of Independence.
From Connecticut, I don't think there was a. I could be wrong, but I don't recall.
I glanced at your book, excuse me, and on page 90 you mentioned William Williams.
See what happens when they read the book?
Sorry about that.
I don't. William Williams. There he is. Yes, there he is. Right. Oh. Yeah. Well, he's there at the Battle of Wood Creek, in that carrying place between the Mohawk River and Lake Oneida. He's not a key player. Did he sign the Declaration of Independence? I'll have to check that.
I had a very brief question and a longer one.
Which one comes first?
What part did he play a part, Amherst, in the expulsion of the Acadians? And then the thing about the Native Americans that always strikes me is how they went within a generation from these very feared and powerful political entities to, after the Revolution, these people, the Americans, just seemed to brush aside, and as they expanded westward. And could you address some of the geopolitical situation that they found themselves in?
General Amherst had no involvement in the Acadian expulsion. The Acadian expulsion was undertaken by Lieutenant Colonel Monckton and by Governor William Lawrence of Nova Scotia, and led by troops commanded by General John Winslow from Marshfield, Massachusetts. It was, for the most part, Massachusetts militia, assisted by British regulars, that rounded up the Acadians in 1754, 55, and expelled them. So Amherst can't blame him for that. Can't blame him for that. In terms of the Native Americans, just a quick answer to that. To keep in mind that what was happening to the Native Americans, and this war simply accelerated the process, is that they were people who had come from a Stone Age culture, very rapidly had been introduced into a modern society. They became extremely dependent upon a modern society for the things that they now needed. For example, guns, gunpowder, metal implements, all of those things, none of which they made themselves. They depended upon white settlers, Europeans, for those implements. They traded for those implements with furs and other products that the white settlers wanted. When those products, such as the beaver, began to deplete, they were in a critical situation because they had lost the purchasing power, shall we say, to buy the very things that they needed. And so that began a decline that was exploited by European settlers all the time. At the same time, the French culture was more, shall we say, more comfortable with Native American culture, and that's a whole other story. The British culture was not. There were two things that English, British settlers hated. They hated trees and they hated Indians. And they wanted to be rid of both. And so the sad story is that in 1763, the culture that is most inimical towards Native Americans wins. And accelerates the decline of Native American populations. That's a thumbnail sketch.
I just wonder, sometimes curiosity was pretty basic, but the rest of the world, I understand that India was more valuable than America or us at the time. And who else was involved in this World War?
Spain, the Dutch, Russia, Austria, Prussia, France, virtually all, Portugal, virtually all of the major European powers were drawn into this war. Sweden, all drawn into the war. And so,
what was the reason, and what countries in Asia were involved?
No countries in Asia, well, aside from certain Indian states that were allies of the English, certainly no countries in Asia were involved. The war never spread to China, for example. War was fought in the Philippines. The British took the Philippines from the Spanish, 1762. There were no Asian nations involved as such, but the war was fought in Asia, in the Philippines, and in India.
At what expense?
Horrendous expense. Yes, question here. Oh, what can we just wait?
I'm not certain if I'm remembering correctly, but when we went out to Fruitlands, I think they said that the King Philip's War made a great big difference in the way the Indians were. Were they less strong? That was before the French and Indian War.
King Philip's War was in 1675. And it was fought primarily here in eastern and southeastern Massachusetts. And it was that war called King Philip's War because it was led, for some time at least, by the Wampanoag chief, King Philip. That was the war in which the Indians came very close to winning. But then the Puritans organized themselves, the New England colonies organized themselves, retaliated against the Indians. As a result of King Philip's War, Indian power in eastern New England, in eastern Massachusetts certainly, was forever broken as a significant military power. But that's almost 100 years before.
Just here then?
Yes, primarily just here in eastern Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire. Yeah.
When you mention about the Native Americans being a Stone Age culture, perhaps at this time in the 18th century, but when the Europeans first encountered the Native Americans, this is just after Columbus, they did have, wasn't a thriving culture throughout the Americas, every bit as advanced as the Europeans, but thus wiped out by the smallpox?
I always find it difficult to talk about cultures as advanced or not advanced. I think the cultures need to be evaluated and understood within their own sort of environment. And I think there's a certain sort of, one sets a priority to say this is an advanced culture and that's not an advanced culture. Cultures evolve. I suspect some people in the world might think we're not a very advanced culture. But when the Europeans did, in fact, encounter the Native Americans, it depended upon where they were. Here in North America, they were less well organized than they were in Middle America, in Mesoamerica, the Aztecs, certainly the Mayas. There was a different culture. It was a climactic matter. That is, that in Mesoamerica and Central America, the climate provided for and allowed for large-scale agriculture, which, of course, is the basis for civilization, before the industrial age in any case. Here in the northern part of our continent, in this part of the world, for example, the Native Americans who lived around here, the Massachusetts, the Wampanoags, the Narragansetts, the Mohegans, were hunters and gatherers. That is, they both farmed and they also hunted and gathered. And they did indeed have a sophisticated culture. They had a sophisticated belief system. which in many ways was quite similar to a Christian belief system. They certainly were well organized, et cetera, et cetera. The arrival of the Europeans brought diseases, of course. They brought a superior technology. Certainly a superior technology for making war. No one was better at making war in the 17th and 18th century than the Europeans. We had a lot of practice at it, and we were very good at it. And so the Native American cultures were overwhelmed by this, but more by the technology and by the organization. So I get a little bit uncomfortable when we talk about relative cultural advances and where an advanced culture is. Suffice it to say that technology and organization overwhelmed the Native Americans. European technology and organization. Maybe just one more.
I was just wondering why the British were anti-tree, and also, did the French or British troops learn any war tactics from the Indians, Native Americans?
Why were the British anti-tree? Because they wanted to farm, and the trees are just a terrible nuisance for farmers, so they just want to get rid of the trees and rid of the Indians. Did the British and the French had learned from the Indians for a long time. Okay, the French-Canadian militia and the French-Canadian Troupe de la Marine were very good at frontier forest warfare. The British did learn, yes, they learned a good deal. One of the officers, by the way, who learned a good deal in the war about how to fight in a wilderness was a then young colonel named Colonel Thomas Gage. Colonel Thomas Gage. Colonel Gage served with General Amherst. Later, of course, General Gage is the officer who was right here. He was the general in command here in Boston during the siege. So I suspect he sat in these pews, or I guess he probably would have ridden a horse as they converted this to a stable. So yes, the British did learn. They did learn indeed. They developed what were called light infantry tactics. They learned how to skirmish a little bit better and became very good at it. Very good at it, yes. So they did learn, yeah. Well, thank you all very much.